The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who is expected to make a statement about the findings in the Commons later, well, she had this to say. This independent review has identified areas where real reform is required. This includes a need for Prevent to better understand Islamist ideology, which underpins the predominant terrorist threat facing the UK. I wholeheartedly accept all 34 recommendations, and I'm committed to quickly delivering wholesale change to ensure we are taking every possible step to protect our country from the threat posed by terrorism. What I find fascinating here, there are certain things that just don't seem to add up to me. How can it be inherently anti-Islamic and against all Muslims? I spoke to an imam last night on a show I was covering between 8 and 9 p.m. And he said, oh, it's against all Muslims. OK, but then at the same time, it is now being accused of, well, potentially anyway, being too soft on it. So how can both of those things be particularly married up? I don't quite understand it. The idea that it's treating radical Islamic or indeed far-right terror as predominantly a mental illness and not some kind of warped, ideological, dangerous criminal behaviour, I think is a little bit of a concern, especially when you look at some of the people who slipped through the net. The amount of terror attacks we've had in this country where people were known to authorities. How can it really be that Prevent is bang up front when it comes to all of this stuff? Oh, and yes, just to top it all off, there was one particular group as well who supposedly took money from the Prevent programme and then went on to support, at least verbally anyway, the Taliban, which is not a great look. And just to top it all off as well, we were even told that this report might be watered down as to not cause racial tension. So doesn't add up to me. Joining me now is Jahan Mahmood, former government advisor on Prevent. Jahan, thank you very much. A lot of strong feelings, quite a lot of them coming from me, to be fair, about this Prevent scheme. Is it inherently anti-Muslim?
Well, it seems to be disproportionately focused on Muslims when the far-right concern is increasing and has been increasing. I have more questions, Patrick, on Shawcross as being the man who's doing the review. That worries me more than anything, to be fair. OK, well, go on. Talk to me about that, then. Well, basically, he belongs to a certain spectrum of people who believe Muslims are going to outbreed the indigenous and take over the country. And I think that is an ideology in its own right, which is closer to some of the right-wing ideologues. Yes, of course, ideology does play a role. But I've also found in my research and having spoken to people who are on the periphery and those convicted of terrorism that some of these guys do have mental health issues. There's no doubt about that. From citing a report by MI5 from 2008, they found that these extremists actually had a poor understanding of their own faith. If it is ideological and Islam has a big role in it, then you'd wonder why the whole Muslim populace isn't up in arms. Especially, but I think, with respect, if I may, I think possibly being slightly disingenuous on a couple of points there. You're clearly a very intelligent man, and I refuse to believe that you don't understand that, for example, the far right are absolutely undisputably on the rise. Far-right terrorism on the rise, but from an incredibly low base. And the main threat, as anyone in the security services will tell you, is still from radical Islamist terrorism. And on that point as well, the argument isn't that all Muslims are bad. It's not that at all. It's the fact that radical Islamist terrorism, which is a warped interpretation... Let me just give you the figures, Patrick. I think on average it works out to about 5 deaths per year due to acts of terrorism by a Muslim, let's say, right? Now, the level of disproportionate focus on Muslims for some Muslim groups and advocacy groups is a concern, and rightly so. I mean, for me, who's been involved in national security and certainly is deeply worried about, any civilian losing their life. I mean, what I don't understand is there are approximately 200 to 300 people who die by way of knife crime every year. The media just doesn't seem to be interested. I'm interested in civilians across the board. Now, that's not true, because I do a heck of a lot on knife crime. And I agree with you, absolutely. The stabathon that seems to be taking place in not just our capital city, but across the country, the breakdown in law and order, yeah, absolutely. But Prevent is specifically counter-terrorism, and you said that kind of only 5 people a year die. I'm sure that you would argue as well that that is 5 too many. But the main reason behind that is that our security services stop so many terror attacks, often at the very, very late stage. And the vast majority of those stops are radical Islamist attacks. No, that's not actually true. In recent years, it's actually been the far right. There's been an increasing number since 2020. So we should look at this from a balanced perspective. And we're not. And I think that people like Shawcross, who has a pretty anti-Muslim view, and he does belong to a group of people, let's call it out for what it is that he believes that Muslims are breeding like rabbits and are somehow going to take over the country. And with the political representation we currently have in government, I mean, I'm pretty inept. I don't see that happening in at least the next 50 years. So we've got nothing to worry about.